The sharp scent of hospital bleach couldn't mask the metallic tang of cordite bleeding through the pediatric ward's ventilation grate. Cora dropped the plastic IV tray, the saline bags hitting the linoleum with a heavy slap. 3 men in tactical gear were already stepping off the service elevator, and the mute 6-year-old boy in room 412 was the only target that mattered. There was no time to hit the panic button at the nurse's station. The men moved with a terrifying synchronized silence that screamed professional hit squad, their suppressed weapons drawn and stabilized. Cora Hastings stood frozen near the charting desk, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Just 20 minutes ago, Doctor, Kenneth Aris had sneered at her as he brushed past in the narrow corridor. "You're taking up the entire hallway again, Hastings," the chief of surgery had hissed, his eyes raking over her size 22 scrubs with undisguised contempt. "A nurse your size is a liability in a code blue. Try to shrink, would you?" She had swallowed the humiliation, pulling her broad shoulders inward, apologizing for the simple fact of her existence. For 3 years, since she lost everything, she had practiced the art of being invisible despite her size. But as the lead gunman pointed his weapon toward the cracked door of room 412, the VIP suite where little Luca Vitiello sat drawing in the dark, Cora stopped shrinking. She didn't scream. Screaming would only give them a target. Instead, she threw her entire, substantial weight against the 300-pound steel crash cart parked beside the desk. The sheer mass of her body, the same body she was constantly told to hide, became an engine of kinetic violence. The heavy steel cart surged forward on its casters, catching the lead gunman completely off guard. It slammed into his knees with a sickening crunch, pinning him violently against the drywall and knocking his suppressed MP5 out of his hands. "What the hell?" the second man barked, pivoting toward her. Cora didn't wait. She dove across the threshold of room 412. Luca was sitting cross-legged on the hospital bed, his small hands clutching a gray stuffed elephant, his dark eyes wide with a silent, paralyzing terror. He hadn't spoken a word since his parents were gunned down 3 weeks ago, and he made no sound now. Cora grabbed him, ripping the IV line from his wrist with a sharp tug, and dragged him off the mattress just as the hallway wall exploded inward. The muffled pops of suppressed gunfire tore through the plaster, sending a shower of white dust and sharp shrapnel raining down over the bed. Cora pulled Luca into the narrow gap between the heavy steel radiator and the reinforced concrete wall. She curled her large body entirely over his small, trembling frame, transforming herself into a human shield. Her thick thighs and broad back created an impenetrable fortress around the child. She squeezed her eyes shut as the door was kicked open, the heavy boots of the second gunman stepping into the room. A sharp, searing heat suddenly tore across Cora's left shoulder blade. The graze felt like a branding iron dragging across her skin, the bullet tearing through her scrub top and slicing the flesh beneath. A ragged gasp tore from her throat, but she didn't move. She just tightened her grip on Luca, burying his face against her soft chest, willing him to look away from the death that had come for him again. "Check the bathroom," a muffled voice commanded from the hall. The gunman in the room took one step toward the radiator. He never took a second. A new sound shattered the terrifying quiet of the hospital ward. It wasn't the suppressed whisper of the hitman's weapons. It was the deafening, unmuzzled roar of a heavy-caliber handgun. The gunman in the room jerked violently forward, his body slamming into the foot of the hospital bed before collapsing onto the linoleum. In a lifeless heap, shouts erupted from the hallway, followed immediately by 3 more deafening shots. Then absolute, ringing silence. Cora remained perfectly still, her breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps, her blood hot and sticky against her back, the scent of copper mixed with the sterile hospital bleach. Heavy, deliberate footsteps entered the room. They weren't the frantic, tactical steps of a hitman. They were the measured, commanding strides of a man who owned the ground he walked on. Luca. The voice was a low, rumbling baritone that vibrated with a terrifying authority. Beneath Cora, the little boy flinched, but then his small hands slowly released their death grip on her scrubs. Cora opened her eyes and cautiously lifted her head. Standing amidst the pulverized drywall and shattered medical equipment was Matteo Vitiello. He was the undisputed boss of the Chicago Camorra, a man whose name was only whispered in the darkest corners of the city. He wore a bespoke midnight blue suit that cost more than Cora's annual salary, but there was nothing civilized about the way he stood. His dark eyes were wild, feral, sweeping the ruined room with a lethal intensity. He held a smoking Sig Sauer in his right hand. When his gaze dropped to the floor, the violent storm in his eyes abruptly froze. He saw Cora, her face pale, her hair falling out of its messy bun, her size 22 scrubs torn and blooming with dark, fresh blood. And tucked safely beneath the substantial, protective curve of her body, completely untouched by the carnage, was his nephew. Matteo dropped to one knee, ignoring the pooling blood of the dead hitman staining his tailored trousers. He reached out, his large, calloused hand gently touching Luca's cheek. The boy didn't look at his uncle. He just buried his face deeper into the soft, warm curve of Cora's neck. "You're bleeding," Matteo stated. It wasn't a question. His icy gaze snapped from the child to Cora's face, analyzing the grimace of pain she was failing to hide. "It's just a graze," Cora rasped, her voice shaking violently as the adrenaline began to crash. They knew exactly which room. They bypassed security. Someone gave them the floor schematics. Matteo's jaw locked, a muscle ticking violently in his cheek. The men he paid to guard this floor were dead in the stairwell. He had barely arrived in time, trusting a gut instinct that told him. The silence on the comms was a trap. He looked at the massive steel crash cart, pinning the first gunman in the hall. And then he looked back at the heavy-set nurse, bleeding on the floor. The hospital staff had cowered. The armed guards had fallen. But this woman, the one society conditioned to be meek, had turned herself into a weapon and a fortress to save a child she barely knew. "Can you walk?" Matteo demanded, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. "I have to hit the code button." Cora stammered, trying to untangle herself from Luca, but the boy let out a silent, panicked whimper, his small fists gripping the torn fabric of her scrubs with terrifying strength. "The police. My job." "Your job is gone," Matteo cut her off, his voice dropping into a dark, absolute register. "The men who ordered this will come back with a badge to finish the job." and they will kill the only witness. You." He stood up, towering over her in the cramped space. He holstered his weapon and reached down, his large hands gripping her uninjured arm. He pulled her up with effortless strength, not flinching at her weight, treating her mass with an immediate, undeniable respect. "You saved my blood," Matteo said, stepping closer, his imposing chest mere inches from her face. "Now I am taking you with it. Do not argue with me." Cora looked into the terrifying depths of his eyes, then down at the mute child clinging to her hip. She nodded once. 3 minutes later, they were in the subterranean parking garage. Matteo practically shoved her and Luca into the reinforced back seat of a waiting black-armored Lincoln Navigator. The heavy steel-plated doors slammed shut, sealing them in a sound-proof vault of black leather and tinted glass. "Drive," Matteo commanded the driver, pulling a burned phone from his jacket. "We are compromised at St. Vincent's. The entire floor is a ghost town. Take us to Wacker Drive." As the massive SUV tore out of the parking garage and merged into the rainy darkness of the Chicago streets, the gravity of her situation finally hit Cora. She was bleeding in the back of a mob boss's car, her nursing career over, her carefully constructed, invisible life shattered. She leaned her head back against the leather, pulling the trembling Luca onto her lap. She wrapped her large arms around him, letting the soft, warm bulk of her body absorb the child's silent shock. Matteo watched them from the front passenger seat in the rearview mirror. He watched the way the nurse didn't try to hide her sighs, the way she used it to anchor the broken boy. He watched the blood seeping through her shirt, a physical cost she paid without hesitation. The syndicate was full of beautiful, fragile people who broke at the first sign of pressure. But this woman in the back of his car had taken a bullet and didn't even drop a tear. The penthouse at 111 W Wacker Drive was a masterclass in cold architectural intimidation. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a dizzying, rain-streaked view of the Chicago River, but the interior felt more like a highly sanitized fortress than a home. Stark white marble floors, sharp, minimalist furniture, and an oppressive silence that seemed to swallow the air. It was no place for a child, let alone a terrified 6-year-old covered in plaster dust. Cora stood awkwardly in the center of the massive living room, her blood-soaked scrub top sticking uncomfortably to her skin. Luca was glued to her side, his small fingers woven tightly into the fabric of her pants. Every time one of Matteo's heavily armed guards moved near the elevator bank, the boy flinched, pressing his face into the soft, substantial curve of Cora's hip. Matteo walked into the room, having stripped off his ruined suit jacket. He carried a heavy first aid kit in one hand and a neatly folded pile of dark fabric in the other. He dismissed the remaining guards with a sharp flick of his chin. The heavy oak doors sealed shut behind them, leaving only the 3 of them in the cavernous space. "Sit," Matteo ordered, pointing to a sprawling charcoal velvet sofa. Cora didn't argue. Her shoulder was throbbing with a sickening, hot pulse. She eased herself down onto the couch, wincing as the fabric pulled at the raw wound. Luca scrambled up beside her, instantly curling into a tight ball against her side. Matteo placed the first aid kit on the glass coffee table and handed the folded fabric to Cora. "Put this on. It will give us access to the wound without cutting your shirt." Cora unfolded the material. It was a luxurious, midnight blue silk robe. But what stopped the breath in her throat wasn't the material, it was the size. She had spent her entire adult life navigating a world built for smaller people, squeezing into chairs, pulling at tight uniforms, suffering the silent judgments of sales clerks when she asked for a 2X. But as she let the robe fall open, she saw the sheer volume of the fabric. It was massive. It wasn't a men's robe hastily offered as a tent. It was a custom, wide-cut garment that clearly belonged to someone who understood exactly how much space she took up and had provided for it. She looked up at Matteo, her dark eyes flashing with a sudden, intense vulnerability. "Where did you?" "My mother was a formidable woman," Matteo said quietly, his voice losing its lethal edge for a fraction of a second. "She commanded a room just by walking into it. She never apologized for the space she occupied. Neither should you." The words hit Cora harder than the bullet graze. A lump formed in her throat, thick and suffocating. Dr. Aris had told her to shrink just hours ago. Matteo Vitiello was telling her to exist. "Change in the powder room," Matteo said, turning his back to give her privacy. "Then I will clean the wound." When Cora emerged minutes later, she felt entirely different. The deep blue silk draped flawlessly over her heavy curves, the rich fabric soothing against her skin, the belt tied securely around her waist. She looked dignified. She walked back to the sofa and sat, leaning slightly forward to expose her left shoulder. Matteo sat beside her. He was close enough that she could smell the expensive cedar of his cologne, mixed with the sharp scent of gunpowder lingering on his skin. He opened the kit, snapping on a pair of black nitrile gloves. "This is going to burn," he murmured, soaking a gauze pad in antiseptic. "I've felt worse," Cora whispered. Matteo pressed the gauze to the raw gouge. Cora hissed, her large hands gripping the velvet cushions tightly. But she didn't pull away. "Who are you?" Matteo asked quietly, his eyes focused entirely on the grim task of cleaning the torn flesh. "Nurses at St. Vincent's hide under desks when the shooting starts. They don't use themselves as battering rams. I'm a pediatric nurse." Cora lied smoothly, the practiced deception rolling off her tongue. "I protect my patients." Matteo paused, his dark eyes lifting to meet hers. "You threw a 300-pound crash cart into a trained killer. Then you threw yourself over my nephew. That is not nursing. That is war." He finished bandaging the wound in silence, securing the white tape with rough efficiency. He leaned back, his gaze shifting to Luca, who had immediately crawled back onto the sofa to press himself against Cora's uninjured side. "He hasn't spoken since October 14th, Matteo said, the date hanging in the air like a gravestone. "My brother's convoy was hit on the interstate. I was supposed to be in the lead car. I changed my schedule by 10 minutes to take a phone call. 10 minutes. The absolute, crushing weight of a Mafia king's guilt bled into the quiet room. They died. He watched it from the back seat. I failed my blood." Cora looked down at the boy. She slowly lifted her hand and began running her fingers through his dark curls. "You didn't fail him tonight," she said softly. Matteo stared at her, an unexpected warmth blooming in the cold, dead center of his chest. He was surrounded by people who feared him, who manipulated him, who wanted him dead. But this woman simply saw the wound, and instead of using it against him, she applied pressure to stop the bleeding. The heavy oak doors of the penthouse suddenly clicked open. The warmth shattered instantly, replaced by the freezing electric tension of syndicate business. Victor Solano, Mateo's underboss, stepped into the room. He was a sharp, immaculately dressed man with predatory eyes and a smile that never quite reached them. He carried a heavy black leather duffel bag, dropping it onto the marble floor with a solid thud. "The hospital is secured, boss," Victor said, his eyes darting toward Cora with a brief flash of disdain before locking on to Mateo. "The local precinct has been paid out. There are no cameras, no logs. 250,000 in banded cash took care of the captain. The narrative is a gang dispute in the parking garage." Mateo stood up, his posture shifting back into the terrifying predator. "And the hitman." "Cleaned up," Victor replied smoothly. "Our people have the bodies. It was the West Side crew, Gallagher's men. We found their burner phones in the van out back." Cora sat perfectly still, her hand still resting on Luca's head. She was supposed to be just a frightened nurse, invisible and ignorant. The storm outside the penthouse glass intensified, heavy sheets of Chicago rain hammering against the reinforced panes, like a barrage of relentless gunfire. But the true danger had already crossed the threshold. 2 hours after Victor had retreated to the lower levels, the heavy oak doors of the grand living room slid open once again. Mateo stood silently by the floor-to-ceiling window, a heavy crystal tumbler of amber scotch loosely gripped in his right hand, watching the city below bleed into the dark. Cora sat perfectly still on the charcoal velvet sofa, the exhaustion sinking into her bones, with little Luca asleep peacefully against her warm side. She had spent the last 2 hours in total silence, her brilliant mind systematically dismantling the entire medical supply chain of St. Vincent's Hospital in her head. Victor stepped into the room, his bespoke shoes clicking sharply against the white marble. He was followed immediately by 4 heavily armed men Cora did not recognize. They were not the standard syndicate guards who patrolled the perimeter. They moved with a tense, coiled, predatory energy, their hands hovering dangerously close to their waistbands. "I told you no one comes up here without my direct authorization," Mateo said, his voice dropping to a lethal, quiet register that seemed to lower the temperature of the entire room. He did not turn around immediately. "We have an escalating situation, boss," Victor said smoothly, taking a confident step forward into the center of the room. "The Chicago police just raided Gallagher's stash houses on the West Side. It is an absolute bloodbath out there. I brought my personal detail up here to secure the penthouse and ensure your safety." Cora reached her trembling hand into the blood-stained pocket of her discarded scrub pants, which were resting neatly on the edge of the glass coffee table. Her thick fingers brushed against the torn pediatric blood pressure cuff she had forcefully ripped from Luca's arm during the initial chaos in the hospital ward. Her thumb deliberately traced the hospital inventory barcode, printed heavily on the blue nylon. "He is lying to you." Cora's words cut through the cavernous, silent room like a sniper's bullet. Mateo turned slowly, his icy gaze shifting from the dark window to Victor, and then finally settling on the woman on the sofa. Victor stopped dead in his tracks, a cold, intensely patronizing sneer twisting his sharp features. "The nurse is in severe shock from the blood loss. Victor dismissed quickly, gesturing casually to one of his armed men. "Take her down to the guest wing and lock her in. She is hallucinating and becoming a dangerous liability. Do not take a single step toward her," Matteo commanded, the sheer crushing force of his voice freezing the armed man completely in his tracks. Matteo looked deeply into Cora's dark eyes. "Speak." Cora stood up. She did not shrink under the predatory, violent stares of 5 armed Mafia enforcers. She pulled the luxurious midnight blue silk robe much tighter around her substantial, beautiful frame, stepping deliberately in front of the sleeping child to shield him. "There was no police raid on the West Side tonight," Cora stated, her voice remarkably steady and ringing with an absolute undeniable authority. "Gallagher's crew did not hit the hospital ward. Sublime's fentanyl patches are Schedule II narcotics. They are rigorously serialized at the factory level and locked in strict time delay safes. A random street crew cannot simply rob a pharmacy for them. They have to be legally diverted through a licensed medical director." Victor's confident sneer faltered heavily, a flicker of genuine, blinding alarm crossing his cold eyes. "What the hell are you talking about, you crazy bitch?" "I am talking about Dr. Kenneth Arris," Cora continued seamlessly, her dark eyes locking onto the traitorous underboss with fierce intensity. "The chief of surgery at St. Vincent's. He has been running a massive shadow inventory for the last 6 months, falsely reporting exorbitant spoilage rates on fentanyl directly to the state medical board. But those patches are not spoiling. He is moving them entirely off the books through a phantom shell company called Apex Medical Supply, a shell company that is legally registered to your brother-in-law, Victor." The silence in the penthouse was absolute, thick, and utterly suffocating. Matteo's jaw locked so hard the muscle threatened to snap. His large hand slowly lowered the tumbler of scotch down to a side table. How could a pediatric night nurse possibly know the corporate registry of a pharmaceutical shell company? Cora lifted her chin proudly, her broad shoulders squared perfectly, finally shedding the invisible frightened persona she had been forced to wear for 3 long years. "Because before I was a nurse, I was Cora Hastings, the lead forensic medical auditor for the state of Illinois. 3 years ago, I aggressively tracked a cartel's massive money laundering scheme right through these same medical supply lines. They framed me, stripped my credentials, and forced me into hiding. But I never stopped watching the numbers. I saw Dr. Arris's supply chain anomalies exactly 2 weeks ago. You didn't just pay the doctor to look the other way tonight, Victor. You paid him to supply the lethal weapons." Victor's face entirely drained of color. The carefully constructed multi-million-dollar lie had completely unraveled in less than 60 seconds, totally destroyed by the exact woman his men had been explicitly ordered to eliminate as mere collateral damage. "Kill them both right now." Victor barked violently, his hand darting frantically beneath his tailored suit jacket to draw his weapon. But Cora was already moving. She did not wait helplessly for the Mafia boss to save her a second time. She grabbed the heavy crystal tumbler Matteo had just set down and hurled it with brutal, staggering force directly into the face of the nearest approaching gunman. The heavy crystal violently shattered against his nose with a sickening crunch, sending him stumbling blindly backward directly into Victor's line of fire. Matteo moved like a demon suddenly unleashed from a cage. He drew his Sig Sauer in a terrifying blur of motion, firing 3 times in rapid, deafening succession. The loud roars completely filled the pristine space, instantly dropping 2 of Victor's loyal men right to the marble floor before they could even clear their holsters. Victor shoved his bleeding loyalist forcefully aside, raising his weapon menacingly toward Matteo. But Cora aggressively launched her massive, powerful frame forward. She violently shoved the heavy marble coffee table across the slippery floor. The thick stone slab slammed viciously into Victor's shins, completely buckling his knees and sending his panicked shot firing wildly into the plaster ceiling. Before Victor could possibly recover his footing, Matteo was already on him. The Mafia boss kicked the gun cleanly from his underboss's hand and grabbed him viciously by the throat, slamming him brutally against the floor-to-ceiling glass window. The heavily reinforced pane groaned dangerously under the violent impact. "You sold my own blood," Matteo hissed heavily, his voice a demonic, terrifying rasp over the wind howling viciously outside. "You put a hit on my 6-year-old nephew. The commission wanted you gone." Victor choked out desperately, dark blood spilling freely from his split lip onto his ruined collar. "You are weak, Matteo. You just let a fat, ruined auditor completely dictate your empire." "She is not ruined," Matteo said softly, the lethal, terrifying calm finally returning to his dark eyes. "She is the only person in this city who sees clearly." Cora walked over slowly, her bare feet completely silent on the cold marble floor. She looked down at the ruined, bleeding underboss. She didn't feel any fear anymore. She only felt the cold, righteous power of absolute justice. "I forwarded the complete Apex medical audit logs directly to the F-Field office exactly 10 minutes ago while you were downstairs," Cora said, staring dead into Victor's panicked, bloodshot eyes. "Your offshore accounts are entirely frozen. Your brother-in-law is currently being detained by federal agents. Even if you manage to walk out of this room alive, you have no money, no syndicate, and no freedom left." Victor stared at her in total shock, the horrific reality of his total destruction finally setting in. He had been thoroughly outplayed, bankrupted, and cornered, not by a rival mafia boss, but by the brilliant woman he had foolishly dismissed as a heavy, invisible nurse. Matteo did not shoot him. He slowly released Victor's throat, letting the broken traitor crumple uselessly to the marble floor. "Call the downstairs cleanup crew," Matteo ordered his remaining loyal guards, who were rushing through the door. "Deliver him directly to the federal courthouse steps downtown. Let the feds tear his life apart." 2 hours later, the penthouse was completely silent once again. The bodies were gone, the broken glass was entirely cleaned, and the violent storm outside had finally broken into a quiet, peaceful gray dawn. Luca was safely asleep in the master bedroom, tightly clutching his small gray elephant. Cora stood quietly near the window, the beautiful blue silk robe perfectly catching the soft morning light. She watched the distant police cruisers swarming the streets below, a silent testament to the corrupt empire she had just masterfully dismantled. Matteo walked up slowly behind her. He did not crowd her, but his intense presence was a heavy, undeniable magnetic force. Victor is gone for good. Aris is currently under federal indictment. The cartel that framed you 3 years ago was funded by the exact same accounts you just froze, Matteo said quietly. He stepped carefully beside her, gently placing a thick manila envelope onto the glass sill. Inside are completely clean credentials, a brand new passport, a fully reinstated medical license, and enough untraceable money to disappear to absolutely anywhere in the world. The door is wide open, Cora. You owe me nothing. Cora looked deeply at the thick envelope. For 3 agonizing years, she had desperately dreamed of running, of getting her real life back. She looked down at her strong hands, then turned slowly to face the most dangerous man in Chicago. He was looking at her not as a debt to be collected, but as a complete equal. He saw her brilliant mind. He deeply honored her substantial body, and he had completely trusted her with his only remaining family. Cora firmly pushed the manila envelope right back across the glass sill. "I don't want to disappear anymore," she whispered softly, her dark eyes locking intensely onto his. "I want to stay right here." Matteo's stoic, terrifying mask finally broke into a slow, devastatingly handsome smile. He reached out quickly, his large, warm hands firmly gripping her waist, pulling her substantial, powerful curves completely flush against his solid chest. He kissed her deeply, a fierce, consuming promise of protection, sealed in the beautiful morning light, just as the private elevator chimed loudly behind them, signaling the unexpected arrival of a new, unknown threat. Did the heart-pounding tension and jaw-dropping twists of Cora and Matteo's dark romance leave you absolutely breathless? This is only the beginning of their ruthless and passionate empire. If you loved watching an underestimated powerhouse take down a Mafia king's enemies and claim her rightful throne, hit that like button right now. Share this story with someone who needs a reminder that true power comes in every size. Subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss another thrilling chapter. Who do you think just stepped out of that private elevator? Tell us in the comments below.